You're all very welcome this evening, and here to help celebrate and to launch this very marvellous collection of essays, Impermanence. I was congratulating the contributors on choosing a theme that is perennially relevant. So you're never at risk. It's like, oh, well, we thought of the theme 6 months ago and now it doesn't seem apt. If anything, much more so in the last little while. I think it was Gail who was recalling the words of Virginia Woolf that all seem to be hubble, bubble, swarm and chaos. And as you scroll through Twitter to find the events of the day, that seemed an extremely good description of that feeling of uncertainty and change. We are extremely lucky to have Gail and Maria and Neil with us to help share their insights and to discuss some of the themes that dealt with in this collection. And we're very fortunate to have Denzil as well to lead the discussion proper. I just wanted to say that we were very proud and pleased to support this collection. It is, as any of you who have read it already know, these are works that some of them are very deeply personal. Some of them deal with really profound trauma, but all of them are moving and thought-provoking contributions to understanding our society here and more widely. All of them are about complexity and nuance, and at a time and a place, and maybe if we're facing into an election where people want to put each other into neatly defined boxes with labels on them, each of these essays is a wonderful rebuttal of that concept and the idea that we are much more than labels or predictable individuals. There was part of me that when I saw the title Impermanence, and I was talking to Nora about it, impermanence kind of felt like a negative thing. It felt like loss, and it felt like anxiety-inducing change. But of course, impermanence is more than that. Impermanence is the necessary condition of having hope for the future, that things do change. And as we approach next year, the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, we are obliged to recall that in addition to the things we are fearful about in the future and the things that we see as losses from our lives, there are also times that we surprise ourselves by overcoming what appeared to be permanent features of negativity. And I think that kind of hope and those kind of rays of optimism do permeate this collection also, and make it even more important and even more truthful as a collection. As I say, I'm just here to hand over to Denzil to lead us in the discussion here. I think there'll be a chance for Q&A afterwards, but thank you all for coming, and you're extremely welcome. Thank you.
Well, thanks, of course, to Lawrence for his very warm welcome. I should say a welcome to you, people who are here, and also to everybody who's watching via YouTube. I'm not quite sure how many people are out there, but we are being watched and listened to. I'm better introduce myself. My name is Denzil McDaniel from Enniskillen, a former editor of the Impartial Reporter newspaper, the beautifully named Impartial Reporter newspaper. It's a privilege for me to be here and to be part of the Belfast International Arts Festival, and I know the folks here tonight will provide some very interesting food for thought. So to just explain, first of all, we're here to discuss this book, Impermanence. As Lawrence has alluded to, I think the government at Westminster have maybe taken impermanence to a whole new level. But this book does cover such ground. Neil, one of the co-editors, will explain the background and the thinking behind it, but certainly when you look at the content, it's superbly written, and there are 12 essays written against a backdrop of great change. Should that be Brexit, COVID, the centenary of partition, and indeed the iconic Notre Dame came into their thinking as well. So the essays are really brilliant. If I could get the advertisement out of the way first, Emma from No Alibis is down the back, and she does have copies of the book as well if anybody wants to follow up there. So what we're doing then is we have 3 of the writers who have written essays for the book. We're going to have some discussion here first, and then we'd like to throw it open for questions from yourselves, and indeed if any questions come in online. So by way of introduction, from the left. Beside me is Gail McConnell, is from Belfast, where she is a reader in English at Queen's. She is interested in the living and the dead, violence, creatureliness, queerness, and the possibilities and politics of language and form, which covers most things, does it? Her debut poetry book, The Sun is Open, won the John Pollard Foundation International Poetry Award and the Christopher Ewart Biggs Memorial Prize. She has also published Northern Irish Poetry and Theology and 2 poetry pamphlets. So welcome to Gail. In the centre, Maria McManus is a poet and creative producer born in Enniskillen and now living in Belfast. Her most recent collection is available tonight. Librettos include Wretches, Ellipses and Tierra Salada. Dance and film collaborations are Bind, Epilogue, Dust and Turf, as well as her essay in Impermanence. Her essays are published in The New Frontier and the Irish Times. So welcome to Maria. And finally, at the far end is Neil Hegarty. Neil now lives in Dublin, but grew up in Derry, and his essay in this book refers to the landscape of the Foyle. His novels include The Jewel, described by the Irish Times as a vital book for our time, and Inch Levels, which was shortlisted for the Kerry Group Novel of the Year award in 2017. Neil's non-fiction includes Frost, That Was the Life That Was, a biography of the great David Frost, and The Story of Ireland, which accompanies the BBC television History of Ireland. Neil, as I referred to, is co-editor of Impermanence, and I'd maybe start, Neil, by asking you to outline some of the background and the reasoning as to how Impermanence came about.
Sure, Denzil, and thanks very much, and thank you everybody for coming. Impermanence started, it began on a day in Paris in April 2019. I had called into the Irish Cultural Centre, which actually published this book in due course with No Alibis Press. And I said hello to Nora Hickey, my co-editor on the book. And then we walked up the hill towards the river, and the air filled with smoke. And we looked down at the river, and we saw that Notre Dame was on fire. And it was one of those moments in life where you feel like you've stepped out of your body in shock. We saw the central spire fall through the roof of the cathedral into the nave, and as you can imagine, the image stayed in my mind. But afterwards, in the weeks that followed, I became aware of another sensation as well as shock, or in parallel with this feeling of shock, which stayed with me. And it was a strange feeling, the strangest feeling that I'd seen something like this in the past, that I'd seen it before. And in conversations that I had with Nora, because she had been there on the day, we kind of teased out what I had been thinking and that she recognised from what I was trying to describe to her, that we had seen it before, in that we had seen the built environment of our lives burn before and continue to burn all the way through the Troubles. I grew up in Derry, as Denzil mentioned. Nora is from Fermanagh. So we were both very schooled in the idea of things which seem to be permanent, which we are told ought to be permanent. The stones of our lives, in fact, can disappear overnight, can burn away, and suddenly they aren't there anymore. So that was the beginning of the project. Nora and the Irish Cultural Centre in Paris wanted to produce something, some sort of a reflection of 100 years of Irish history, 100 years since the partition of the island, and we thought at the beginning that we would put together a podcast series, and it was sold to our contributors as, in fact, a podcast series. And then Nora spoke to David in No Alibis. We realised that the essays, frankly, were of such quality that if we possibly could, they should be put together as a book. So everything went in step by step, some steps expected, some unexpected. But in my mind, it all goes back to that day, that shocking day in Paris, when I saw a building which has stood for almost 1,000 years vanish in a couple of hours.
Can I ask you specifically about your own essay? I sometimes think that, I know we're all very resistant to change sometimes, and we worry about change and we look for certainty. And sometimes we think that we get that certainty from our surroundings, our landscape, which has been there for centuries and so on. But you kind of talk in your book about the foil, and you talk about the temporary landscape and the engineered landscape. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of, in the context of climate change and how the landscape also changes so much?
Yeah, my essay is, as you said, it's called Klondike, and that's a reference to the very strange sort of Wild West flavour of Lough Foyle at the moment. As I'm sure you all know, Lough Foyle, in legal terms, but it belongs to nobody. It's claimed by the UK. That claim is disputed by the Republic, and as a result, there isn't any legal oversight of what happens on the waters of Lough Foyle at the moment, and that means that there's this very strange thing about the oyster fishery in the waters. It's unregulated by anybody. Everybody is making loads of money down there, but nobody is in charge of this place. But so that's where the name Klondike comes from. The place itself, as I'm sure some of you know, is strikingly beautiful, and it's a very odd landscape. The whole of the east side of Lough Foyle is made up of reclaimed land. So there are sea walls, and then on the other side of the sea walls, the land falls. It's extremely rich, extremely fertile, but the sea is being held back, and you have this lovely place where you have a sort of vast kind of dome of sky. You have a vast sea. You have these, it seems like permanent landscapes on the other side of these sea walls. And I like to go walking when I'm in Derry in this nature. It's a nature reserve. It's a new nature reserve in the suburbs of the city. And if you like, the inherent drama of the place is even more magnified by this sense that the border is just there. It kind of runs at your feet, and it runs beyond your feet into the water, and then it stops. And every time I go there, as you can imagine these days, I'm very aware of this delicate balance between land and sea. I'm very aware that it looks like it'll last forever, but the fact is it isn't going to last forever any more than the sea defences, the whole eastern side of the loch are going to last forever, because they aren't. So yeah, there's a drama on all sorts of levels and all sorts of layers in that place. The beauty is kind of it's mixed, or it's balanced by danger, and it seems to me that danger, even though we aren't talking about it enough, is rising and rising all the time.
And Maria, as well as landscape, you talk a little bit about people and the effect of change in your life. I was very struck. Your opening line was, "I think about dying every day," which kind of grabbed my attention straight away. And you talk quite a bit about the change in your life when your mother died. It was quite an emotional read, actually. And you go on then to explore darkness and the relationship between darkness and change and transformation. How did you find writing that? Was it a tough thing to do? Was it cathartic in any way? Or
it was kind of a necessary place to go. I started actually when Neil had asked for an essay. The place I went to first was this metaphor of the Marble Arch Caves, which was not far from one of the homes I lived in Fermanagh. And what struck me about that was that actually the caves are really shaped by the erosion of water through the limestone, that the water just finds its own level and its own way through that. But when it falls from in rain and onto the landscape, it disregards the border entirely. You'll know this. It falls on Culca. Some of it will run off into the south. Some of it will run off into the north, down through the Marble Arch Caves. And it was that kind of really digging into what's happening at a molecular level, that there is a constancy of water running through that. It's taken millions and millions of years to shape something that is exquisite, that's treacherous, that's dark. And I suppose it's the interplay of transformation, resistance, strength, the metamorphosis that happens. It's some kind of magic and alchemy that is all going on in the dark. And I suppose the parallel then across to imagination and the parallel to lived life and how you metabolize difficult things. That difficult things come along, but and equally, while they're terribly engaging and difficult to metabolize, sooner or later you do work your way through them. And I suppose the bad things don't last either. Sadness doesn't last, or pain doesn't last, or, in the same way that nice things don't last sometimes. But so I suppose it was a very deep-rooted overview about the kind of things that are there for us to metabolize as traumas on the one hand, and opportunities for making something new and playful. And I think sometimes I've lived my life back to front, because I think I was much more miserable as a child and as a teenager than I ever am now. And I just think life's gotten better, and that surprises me. And also, there is something about really understanding that when you commit to writing an essay like this, that at some level it's not about you. It's in service of the enormity of what people here have to process. And in lots of ways, I didn't have anything like the trauma many people here have experienced. And still, to put a language on that, to begin to articulate that, feels like an important conversation that we collectively need to have, because that's in service of our future. It's in service of the present and the choices that we make about moving on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I suppose sometimes, if we look at we talk about the trauma that we have in this country and so on, a lot of people don't. But you seem to have built, with that understanding, some sort of resilience, do you think? Were you able to cope because of your understanding of that? Or, it's a very powerful message that you would share with others going through trauma. I think you did say at one point, change happens. It's inevitable. So
yes.
Not everybody can do that, but
and I wouldn't say that I found that necessarily easy either. But the the title of my essay is Gradually, Suddenly, which seems like a contradiction, and in a way they are still part of the same thing, because it's like when change happens, you can always see that there were antecedents. And you can always, begin to get your head around the complexity of what the consequences of a thing are. And then what do you make out of that through to the future? And I think in some ways what I was trying to do through this was draw a parallel between drawing on what's very deeply within me as a response from my own self, and to understand what makes me tick. With that, when difficult things happened when I was a child, I was an oddball, really, behind the sofa, in the hot press, under the stairs, these under the bed even, anywhere where it was dark, where it was quiet, where I could go, me and the dog or me and a book or whatever it was. And you might think they were odd kind of responses. In lots of ways they were, but I kind of look now on the opportunity there was in that, to have an imaginative life, to begin to create something new out of things that are fearful or are dark, and make a friend of the dark, actually, and not be afraid of that. To see it as an opportunity, and in the same way as to put a name on fear, and to be able to name something like anxiety, but be able to also sit alongside yourself and say, okay, now what do I do? What do I do with that? So awareness, I suppose, is central to it.
And Gail, then you talk as well about loss in your essay. There's a quote that I want to read, but your essay considers ways of surviving loss and harm and coming to terms with impermanence of various kinds. You talk about the octopus, the act of adaptation, escape and self-preservation, and you relate that to your personal loss of your father, who was murdered. Would you talk a little bit about those areas?
Yeah, I mean, my essay is all over the place. It's sort of lighthouses and worms and an octopus and a tumble dryer. No, there isn't a tumble dryer, but yeah. First of all, let me just say it's a real pleasure to have work in this book, and I'm full of admiration for all the essays that are in here. And Maria's, I think, is extraordinary in the way that it really reckons with time and with that idea of everything being gradual and sudden, which I think really goes back to what Neil was saying about seeing something burn, which seems so sudden, and yet you realise it's so familiar and you've known it all along. And there's something in all of these essays, I think, about coming to terms with different timescales, like timescales that are like overlaid, things that are happening now and at terrifying speeds, but also have this really, really long history to them as well. So my essay, I suppose, is it starts out in an exhibition. Well, it starts out with a poem that I love called Lighthouse Keeping, and how I got there was through visiting an exhibition of photographs by the Belfast photographer Donovan Wiley, whose work I love. And he had an extraordinary exhibition here in Belfast a few months ago of these lighthouses, which he shot during over the course of the last few years, kind of the run up to Brexit and post Brexit, and there are lighthouses in France and in the UK. And I was just really struck by these images, which are most of the photographs you can see the light, but there's at least one where you can't. And I found myself with this kind of rising panic, standing in the darkness of the exhibition space, thinking, where is the light? And sort of noticing my need to see this thing, which actually, by the time the photograph's taken, it probably isn't even there anymore because of how the moment of time kind of works. But I started to think about what is a lighthouse and what is that light? it's a symbol. It's by nature impermanent because it has to be on and off. It has to be lit and extinguished and relit and extinguished. And yet it's a permanent feature of a landscape that is kind of a welcome sign and a warning sign sort of all at once. Which led me, I suppose, somehow to think about partly what Maria's been talking about a moment ago, which is how do we survive our lives and how do we survive the losses and the harms that come along, and how do we survive impermanence? And it's creatures, I think, who've taught me something about how to survive your life. The octopus, who has this extraordinary capacity, if attacked, to self-sever, just to cut off a limb and swim away. And the limb, it actually stays alive eerily for a little while and goes off the other direction, but it self-severs to get away from whichever predator has kind of, gripped on, and carries on. It lives with loss and hurt for a while, but then a new limb slowly will grow. I just find that an extraordinary, it's not even a metaphor, it's just an extraordinary truth of the non-human world. Or I think about the worm who lives under the earth, who's blind, who can't see at all, and who lives by eating and excreting. That's the life of the worm. It's really dull, it's really repetitive, it's the same stuff every day, just eating and excreting, eating and excreting. And it's boring labour. But because of that, Darwin praises the worm, the extraordinary labour of the worm, because of that life, that repetitive, blind life, we have everything that flourishes in soil. We have flowers and fruit and, plants and colour and everything because of this creature that we would hardly even notice and look at. So I include some poems in the essay because for me it's those creatures who've really taught me something about how to kind of survive. Yeah, for me, the big loss, the kind of obvious, explicit trauma of my father's murder. I was 3 when it happened. I was outside our home. But like Maria was saying a moment ago, I think there is a gift in that if you can reckon with it, not at the time at all, not in the suddenness of it, but in the gradual of it. And the gift is that there's an invitation to live with loss and to live with impermanence and to find a way to do that. And the gift for me was, if you figure that out early, then and as I sort of had to do somehow, it kind of sets you up for all the other inevitable losses and inevitable impermanences, big and small scale, that you will face in your life. Because the one thing that connects all of us is that we live with loss and that we live with impermanence. It's the solid condition of our individual lives, but of our communal life, our life together. It's the thing that we have in common. And so the sooner you kind of reckon with that and learn to live with it and learn to live well and even to expect it and not to be terrified of it. This is what I love in Neil's essay too, this idea of how do you see change and decay and volatility as being what is, not being an exception to what is, but being the conditions of what is. The sooner that you do that, the sooner that you can find joy and life and peace and pleasure in everything that happens. And to look at it for what it is, to think then, okay, well, climate change is very real, that is coming, that's an impermanence that we need to reckon with more seriously. But so the octopus, the worm, the narwhal, all these creatures, they've taught me something, I think, about going on, about keeping going, even when everything's changing.
And was that a subconscious process that you learned all those things? I mean, obviously you're not consciously. It took you some time, obviously, to work out that you had actually learned all this.
Yeah, and you don't know sometimes what you know until you write a poem or an essay or whatever. It's a process of discovery. It's genuinely your curiosities that lead you into these things. So I was just interested in, what's a worm all about? And I was down the rabbit hole of watching, YouTube videos of worms crawling about and trying to, and not even necessarily knowing why I was interested in this. And then you write the poem and realise, oh, okay, yes, something of my unconscious was trying to understand, trying to know and learn something from this other. I think, yeah. So yeah, they creep up on you sometimes, these these things that you learn.
Would you mind reading something from your essay for us?
I guess I'll read. This is like a little bit of a cheat to read a poem when it's a book of essays. But since we're talking about the worm, I guess I'll read it if I can find it. So many post-it notes in here from other people's bits of the essays that I want to quote. There is proper prose in this as well, from me. I mean, it's not just poems. Worm. Burrowing in your allotted patch, you move through the dark, muscles contracting one by one in every part, lengthening and shortening the slick, segmented tube of you, furrows in your wake. Devising passages for water, air, you plot the gaps that keep the structure from collapse. Dead things you know, plants and creatures both. Your grooves shift matter, sifting as you go. Eyeless, your appetite erates. Eating the world, you open it. You ingest to differentiate. Under the foot-stamped earth, you eat into a clot of leaf mould, clay, and mildew, and express what you can part with, as self-possessed as when you started. Your secretions bind the soil. Your shit enriches it. How things lie now will be undone, will reoccur. You, a surface-level archivist, sensing all there is can be gone through, the body born within its plot.
And Maria, would you like to please read something for us?
Thank you. I'm going to, sorry, 1 second. I'm going to read a little section here that's about being in the dark. I spent a lot of time in the dark, under the stairs, in the hot press, in the bottom of wardrobes, under my bed, behind the settee. Anywhere the sounds of the world could be attenuated and muffled. I could close my eyes, but I couldn't close my ears. When I closed my eyes to go to sleep, girls appeared, shape-shifting out of the murk in reds and greens and cobalt. I made up soundless stories in gesture, shadow puppets in the beam from a lamp. In one of my early reading books, there were instructions and pictures of how to make a rabbit shape, a wolf, a swan, a butterfly. The alchemy of light, my hands, the dark. Hear the story of Red Riding Hood. How dark it was in the belly of the wolf. Hear Jonah, because it was dark in the belly of the whale. A Bible story of golden honey and bees in the dark, bleak belly of a dead lion. It was also dark in the forest, Hansel, wasn't it? Gretel? Wasn't it dark there? Talia, little briar rose. When you slept for 100 years, it was also dark there, wasn't it? Magic happened. The elves changed the fortunes of the shoemaker and his wife, but always under the cover of darkness. Simple games with torches, behind the curtains playing stage or make it up, with a model theatre, a proscenium arch of card and balsa wood, lush images of curtains and paper characters on wee pokey sticks. It was all play.
And Neil?
I'll read a wee bit which chimes so well with what Maria and Gail have been saying over the last couple of minutes. I suppose which kind of reflects, in spite of the content of my essay, which has to do with global warming, which is not a happy tale, it still comes back to a fundamental optimism that I have. Just here, just where the ships sail silently by, the River Foyle flows out into the loch. And just there at my feet, the turf falls down into the sea marsh, all raised banks and shallow waters where wading birds live summer and winter alike. October, and the wind is fresh, let's say, and getting fresher by the day. And any minute now, though the summer swallows are gone, the winter visitors, the brent geese and the hooper swans, will be arriving from Greenland. This is a temporary landscape, this grassy expanse on the southern shore of Lough Foyle. It is strictly impermanent. Like those polders over to the east, it has been embanked and protected from the sea. It too is reminiscent of a Dutch landscape, lifted and draped across the soil in this northern district of Ireland. And it has changed, this landscape, and changed again. 20 years ago, it was that unglamorous entity, a municipal dump just north of Derry's suburbs, clouds of gulls looking for pickings and yellow machinery heaving and moving. It was not a place to come for an autumn walk. Then the council closed the area and dealt with the waste and slowly turned the land into something else, something more expansive and generous, into a refuge for birds and insects with grass left uncut and trees planted here and there. And even that salt marsh conjured marvellously into being. And there are paths running through the grass for walkers to get out and taste the salty air and feel the wind, keen and getting keener, on their faces. And to look at that blue dome of sky, which reaches over the land and sea and distant basalt cliffs, capturing, holding, retaining. It looks permanent, doesn't it? But I know that in the years to come, this landscape and nature reserve today will, in all probability, be abandoned to the sea, the whole expanse turned over to salt marsh, perhaps. It simply may no longer be possible to hold the water back. The sea will reclaim this space. It will flow again where it flowed in years past.
I think at this stage I'd like to invite questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, and we do have a roving mic, so if you hold off until the mic comes to you. If you're happy to identify yourself and say who you are, that's fine. If you want to just ask your question, that's fine as well. But does anybody want to ask any questions of our panel? This lady here.
I just wanted to congratulate you. That was really lovely to hear. The stories were all so different, even though they had the common theme running through them. And I just wanted to ask this collectively, putting the stories that are in your head on paper and releasing them onto the page, did it give you a kind of freedom or a kind of contentment or release once it actually was out of your hands and written on the page?
If I go first, I think that, well, what I know for me is I understood certain things better for my own self. That the through lines of certain traits or responses to difficult things become, they may be accidental or reactive at some point in future, but the older you get and the more you examine those things, the broader your own repertoire becomes about how choiceful you can be about how you respond to something really difficult. And I think that there is a certain amount of freedom in that, because you or I believe I'm acting then out of more awareness and making active choices with a thought about what the consequences of those things are. So there are a lot of reflections back into my own childhood, difficult things. And I think as an adult now, living here, I feel very committed, disappointed in a way that we haven't gotten further, you know, as one of the generation who inherited this situation. Remember very clearly, I was 5 years old when we had, when the Troubles kicked off. I remember that so distinctly. It's inconceivable in some respects that we haven't sorted that whole thing out. And I, as an adult, feel that very strongly that I want to be part of the solution so that the children, Gail's child, for example, our children today who are hungry, who are in cold houses, who are being cared for by parents who are exceptionally stressed or impoverished or not having to do that. So there is a freedom on the one hand, and with it comes responsibility on the other, to put our shoulders to the pump and see what we can do to bring about change. And, you know, in our broad political context, what's happening in this country today is unacceptable. So I hope I'm not over-egging it in terms of saying, yes, to your question, there is a freedom and there are responsibilities that come with that. And the reflective back, looking at those through lines from childhood to now really matter in terms of being aware. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you for the question. When you asked it there, I was thinking, what is the risk that my essay takes? Like, what is the exposure? Like, what is it that I give that might feel like release? And what I realised was, it's a few sentences that I'll read. At the end of 2021, I was spent. I'd been giving readings from The Sun is Open at festivals and events and doing loads of interviews while teaching and supervising and doing other bits of research and writing. Then I got COVID and our toddler got COVID. I was ready to collapse. I wanted to collapse. Talking about the book had taken it out of me. And then I talk about I'd created the book essentially in private at my own pace, quietly. But then the book was in the world, and the next challenge was to embody the work, voice it, breathe the poems into the world. And after months of that, I needed to curl up in a ball or to sever a limb and swim away. And I was really glad to have the chance to write that. And I suppose I surprised myself with it because on the surface of things, you know, I'd written this book about my father's murder and the aftermath of it, you know, and it won some prizes. And I was going around and reading these poems, and I had everything, you know, it looked quite together in doing it, and I was, but for a while, and then I was absolutely exhausted. And that's a part of the writing life, I think, that we sometimes don't speak about so readily, that there's a cost to doing these things. And it was really important, actually, to be able to acknowledge that. And so there was a release in that, actually, as well, for me. I think that was the part of it that felt that was as true of my life as the writing of the book itself. You know, the aftermath of it, of feeling I'm completely spent and I need to just go and lie in a dark room for a while. So there was, I think being able to own that part of, that inevitable part of like darkness and silence and exhaustion, which is an inevitable part of the writing life, where you've just got nothing to say and you don't even want to try. I think I was able to sort of, reconnect with that and kind of own it a little bit, and that was a release, I suppose, if that answers the question.
My mind always goes back to something that Maria said actually 7 or 8 years ago now at a poetry reading. She gave at a festival in Bray outside Dublin, and there was a panel of northern female poets. And, you know, the talk got on as it does to the situation here and so on. And Maria made the point that in the absence of anything resembling a sort of normal politics, the field has in a way been left open to other people, including to writers and to artists, to say things that politicians can't say or don't want to say or won't say. And on top of that again, we don't necessarily have an axe to grind. So people can take on board what we say, they can trust our motivations in saying it. And that always stayed in my head. It was a perfect encapsulation of what I had been thinking, of what had been bubbling in my head, but I'd never said to anybody. And when Nora, Hickey and I were thinking about this ghostly project, the most important thing that we both felt was that we wanted the book, as it turned out, to make some kind of a difference, for the people in the book to be saying things which would chime, which would resonate with readers, so that they could say, that's what I think, but I haven't really heard this or that said very, very often, and I feel a relief at hearing it said. And I know when I wrote my own essay, Klondike, for this, I felt surprised at what was popping up on the page, and I think that the thing is, if you like, the knack is, as you get a bit more experienced and as you get older, that you want to learn to expect that surprise to manifest. It's when you feel the surprise that you know that everything is going okay on the page, that your kind of subconscious mind is taking over a little bit, and your conscious mind is kind of taking a back seat, and the words, the stuff, if you like, that's manifesting on the page is what is supposed to be there and serves a larger purpose.
Any other questions? I'm not. Lauren? So somebody here, yeah?
Hi. I just wondered, you're all speaking about, obviously, impermanence, and you've used the word metabolizing your impermanence. And I wondered if you could say something about who helped along the way to help you write the essay, helped you metabolize.
Could I say something about that? The sort of founding image, or the original image for my essay was a comment that my mother made years and years ago, and she was laughing as she made it. This is about 20 years ago, and she was talking about a period in Derry City Centre in the 70s where she had a run of three identical experiences. She had stopped to look at a shop window and admired the shop window, and the next day the window and the building were gone. And then it happened again, and it happened again. The buildings vanished the next day. And I shouldn't laugh, but the way she described it, she was laughing, and she said it made me feel. But I had a sense of the stress that she was under at the time that she was describing. She said it made me feel as though I had the evil eye in spite of myself. I was sort of ill-wishing all these commercial premises as I was going about my everyday business. And it's, as you can imagine, it stuck in my head. Not least because she said, you were in the pram with me at the same time. So I was bouncing you around Derry City Centre, ill-wishing all these places. And that is an image that stayed in my mind. And when I sat down to write my essay, I mean, I haven't used the word, but yeah, you could say I metabolized it. I put it in as an example of what Gail was saying, that this is an inevitable part of the texture of our lives. The violent side of these things shouldn't happen, but they have happened. It's what you do with the the facts and the memories and the kind of layers in your head. It's what you do with them years later and how you learn to live with them that counts for something.
I suppose, I don't really even know quite how to answer that question, except to say that actually as an adult, I certainly have chosen a family of friends across the years, many of whom are people who've been in my life now for the best part of 40 years, who are my anchor people. And I think that, I've said it before, I come from a family where you might arguably say we put the funk in dysfunctional, but we really do, full of good people, but it doesn't necessarily work that well. And actually there is something about the absolute value of friendship, the people that you gather along the way who choose to have you in their lives, and the act of writing in itself is some willingness to go into the dark parts, to accompany yourself to the dark parts of your own experience and bring back what it is that you learn. And not necessarily to be afraid of that, but to be curious about it, and to experience it as a rich place full of potential, alongside all the other things that you already know that are there, hurt, pain, sadness, blah, 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 but the only way to work your way through them is to experience them and experience them fully, and then they come to an end and the next thing comes, and it's never too late to have a happy childhood, I think.
I really love the question. It's a really good one, and it strikes me that it's endless, really, like the metabolizing. I'm still doing it, and it changes all the time. So I think it's taken numerous forms in my life, and different forms have served different purposes for a while and then haven't quite worked. So to give you some examples, I grew up, my parents had very strong Christian faith. So for my mum, when my dad was murdered, it was turn the other cheek, love and forgive. And Christianity was a story that gave her a way of surviving her life. And that for a long time helped her and helped me, the idea of there being a divine father figure. That was something that let me survive my life. And that was very good for a while. And then it wasn't so satisfying. And then I read a lot, and reading books brought me into contact with other forms of loss and other forms of impermanence. And I found a comfort in knowing, oh, okay, there's a whole world of richness and complexity and difficulty and trauma, and that gave me a sort of it gave me a comfort in knowing that I wasn't utterly alone in that. Talking therapy was another one. I've had loads of talking therapy. It's been really good. It's been a really important part of reckoning with difficulty and trauma. And starting a family of my own and becoming a parent, like my son Finn, who's 4 now, has just taught me so much about what it must have been like to be the 3-year-old that I was when my father was killed. And for so long it was hard to even imagine that I had a relationship with my father because I couldn't remember it at all. But then when you have a 3-year-old child, it's like, oh my goodness, by the time he's 3, we've lived like 6 lifetimes together. Like there's 6 lifetimes in a day, So of course I knew my father and had this intimate relationship with him. So like that helps me metabolize the loss. And that's like 40 years after my father was killed. But it's a lifetime's work, living in the aftermath of loss, I think, and trying to metabolize it. And on different days it's easy and hard. And that's the other thing about impermanence. A reckoning with pain doesn't come to an end either. It's not finished work. So I think there'll probably be new forms of metabolizing as well. But I love the question, because I think if you're alert to it, if you start being like, if you're on the hunt for those things, like that help, then you'll know how to survive your life. If you're like, what are those tactics, or what are those companies, or what are those images, or that help me metabolize this, then there's hope, I think. Yeah.
It's the idea that the longer you live, you're not just experiencing your present and building your future, you're changing your past, including your most distant past, with every passing moment. So that if we're sitting here in 10 years' time, the memories that you have, for example, as a 3-year-old, are going to be different again. So that past has been rebuilt, has been, in a sense, relived all over again. And I love that powerful image that you build your you build your present, you build your future, but you keep on building and rebuilding your past as well, and that never stops. It's the more I think about that, the more fantastically powerful it feels, and the more kind of liberating it feels as well.
When you think about it on a collective scale, I mean, that's the challenge for us in this place, right? It's like, how do we reckon with the past? But if we think about the past as something that we can change our perspective of, and enrich and build and rebuild and make more nuanced and more complex, then what an extraordinary collective work to do together. But we're not doing it because we're terrified of it, and when we disagree about, what and who and how, and we have a government that wants to say, never mind all that, never mind. But there's a capacity here for us to, exactly as you say, not just imagine a future, but reimagine a past, and that gives me incredible hope. It really does.
And in some respects, it's also about also really at a profound level understanding that enormous contradictions coexist. That alongside the very real pain and the very real loss is, the future is always at point blank range. And there is always the opportunity to make a choice in the here and now about what happens and how you respond. And that actually, fear often is driven by reactivity. Fear can't be disregarded. But if we can manage our experience of fear, and manage our experiences of loss, feel them fully, and allow that in the other, then we can be different. And we have, what choice have we? We continue going the way we're going now, or we do something different. And I just feel a compelling duty in a way to engage in the conversation. And what I love is that for us as writers or as artists or whatever, we can do that in a really proactive and evocative way without it destroying things, or without it necessarily provoking the same responses that people have always had. It creates some space for nuance, some space to reflect and to be with it.
Okay, I know there were one or two more. I'm not sure, Alan. Are there any questions coming in online? No. Sorry, there was somebody else who wanted to. Was it Lawrence? Did you want to make a point?
I think I put up my hand. I was very reluctant to let an extremely thoughtful conversation, which I've been enjoying so much, I didn't want it to end. So I thought I would ask perhaps two questions, and then you can pick either one that you find more interesting. Neil, you spoke about Notre Dame and the image of it and how it struck you in that kind of external public event and how it inspired you. And I was just wondering for Gail and Maria whether, this book, as Denzil mentioned, was contextualized against the backdrop of Brexit and COVID and the centenary and were the things in the mix in the background of your mind in that kind of external public shared experience sense that contributed, to the context in which you wrote these essays yourselves? And then I suppose the second optional question of, do you think impermanence is just simply a more inspiring concept for a writer than permanence? If Neil and Nora had come and said, we want you to write an essay on the theme of permanence, would you have carefully edged out of the room, or do you think there are things there that you would have been able to latch onto?
I remember when I was a master's student, I was writing a dissertation about Sinead Morrissey's poetry, which I loved, and love. And I was interviewing her. She was kind enough to let me interview her. And I remember she said something that struck me. She said, the only solid thing is that everything's going to change. She said it like, like a prophet or something, And I could feel, on the one hand, like this terrible recognition rising at me, but also this terrible resistance to what she was saying. And it was like both of those things at once. Like, I knew what she was saying was right, but I didn't want it to be true. The only solid thing is that everything's going to change. And I think that just made such an impression on me. It actually gave me it was a challenge. It was another challenge to learn to live well with that reality. And some of the poets I love and admire, and the writers admire too, like Virginia Woolf, but people like Louis McNeice and Derek Madden and other people from this place who write about flux and things coming and going. The tide goes out and comes in again. That sense of this is the way things are. So no, I could not have written an essay on permanence to answer that question. And actually, and why is that? Like, my associations, I think, with permanence maybe, just now that I'm thinking about it, or something to do with things being a little stultifying, or like petrification, or sort of a hardening over in a way that's, well, at worst, kind of deathly, I suppose. I mean, there are obviously really positive ways to think about permanence, like if you're married to the same person for a long time or something, but actually, maybe that's the thing that's more unnerving. I don't know, we'll have to think about it a little bit more, but sometimes we make claims for things being permanent that really are quite unstable claims, maybe.
I think the concept of permanence is terrifying. Jesus. I certainly wouldn't have found that. I didn't find this easy to write, but it wouldn't have given me the same imaginative space, I don't think, or the same kind of, that sense that uncertainty or the unknown or a level of ambiguity leaves us a little bit more latitude to scratch around and see what's there. And I kind of immediately asked that question. I went back to, I think it was 2011, sort of May 2011, I was kind of in a salaried job and nice house and husband and 2 children, the whole business. And 10 months later, I had walked out of the job, walked out of the marriage. The second of the 2 children had left home and the house was on the market, And it's kind of like every leg of the stool was gone, and it was my own absolute deliberate doing. And I wasn't reckless about it. It was dramatic and it was very sudden, but it was also deliberate and intentional, and it was just time. And it certainly was an undoing of every leg of the stool in a way. But actually it was still a better choice to make than sit and go, is this my life? Is this my life, making myself do work that I'm now burnt out at doing? And actually, in health and social care, and you kind of think that's not a good place to be if you're done. It's somebody else's job, and to kind of go, So actually, I chose impermanence. I chose uncertainty because there was more space in it than this other tidy business. And ironically enough, a couple of years later, I've created a new tidy business, but it feels really nice. House, husband, you know, blah, blah.
I suppose I would just add to that I'm very glad I didn't go with that other concept. It might not have worked very, very well. It was striking to me and to Nora Hickey that as soon as the idea came into focus, floated into our heads, and as soon as we made contact with the essayists, there was a sense of kind of chiming instantly. Everybody knew exactly what we meant. Everybody knew exactly what you meant, what they meant. And the whole process flowed as smooth as caramel, which is such a great thing, such a great experience to have had as the editor of the book. It was one of the best professional experiences of my life. So I'm very grateful for that.
Listen, thanks for your questions, folks. I'm afraid our time is gone. That's a very interesting line that Maria has just said that struck me about, we tend to think of, we really want certainty and we want, and yet, permanence terrifies you. I always think, when I worked in the Impartial Reporter, we had a fantastic boss, a lady called Joanna McVeigh, and things were going really well. Paper was selling well, everything was going superbly well. But she said to me one day, if things are going to stay the same around here, things are going to have to change. So it's, I think that's all part of the fluidity of life. If I could maybe finish up with a few pointers. I hope you enjoyed this evening. I'm sure you did. We also have quite a number of other events in the festival, and I'll maybe just skip through one or two of them. If you go onto the website, you'll see, for example, on Saturday, and I'll not go through it all, but two of Britain's most exciting young writers, Benjamin Wood and Ross Raisin, visit Belfast. Next Tuesday, Jonathan Coe, described as one of the finest and funniest chroniclers of modern England. Wednesday, the John Hewitt Society are having 3 acclaimed Irish poets. Thursday, there are a couple of Caribbean writers talking about the complexities of the 21st century Caribbean. And then next Saturday, special lunchtime event at Anne Culturel, Sean Connolly and Turtle Bunbury. So check out the website. There really is a lot on, a lot of interesting stuff, but certainly no more interesting. I found that absolutely fascinating tonight. And I think, Lawrence, if anybody wants to have a drink, and maybe if there's more questions that you want to ask, but thanks everybody for their attendance, and in particular thanks to Neil, Maria and Gail. Thanks very much.